Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith, and we had just a little bit of a scare there just before the countdown where producer Jay lost internet and left us all hanging. So we're going to try our best to keep it rolling, but if it does disappear, please, everyone, just hop back on. We'll be back, I promise. Shout out to John, who's back and is back being first to welcome everyone. So thank you, John. Welcome here. Scott's here, Canadian Cowman. I hope you're drying out as well, which is fantastic. And yes, of course, Viren, you're the first Viren to say hello. And hey, Real Ag Hats, glad you mentioned it, John. I do have a special plug for that. This week, of course, we're going to talk about weed control, weed spectrums, all those sorts of good things. But next week, we're going to have a year-end wrap-up. And for participation, you will get a Real Ag Hat. Now, before we get rolling with tonight's show, I did want to send out a thank you and a shout out to our show sponsors. So Adama Canada, of course, is our first sponsor to come on board, but did want to mention, of course, Real Ag Radio. That's Monday to Friday on Rural Radio Channel 147. That's 4:30 Eastern. Sean Haney hosts Real Ag Radio. And Mind Your Farm Business happens every 2 weeks. It's a podcast. You can find it on Real Agriculture, tackling all the biggest farm management decisions you need to make. Some really great discussions on there. And shout out to producer Jay, who came up with the name. All right. And Adama, we do have a read for Adama because they have their stuff together. While other sources of innovation run dry, Adama is here to deliver, leveraging the world's largest library of actives to provide innovative crop protection solutions to your greatest challenges. We're all in on you. Talk to your Adama sales rep today or visit adama.com. So big thank you to them. And within a few weeks, I think I'm going to have this memorized. So that is fantastic. Okay. And as always, of course, you do get CU credits for joining us this evening. Just head over to realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow morning and sign up for those. Okay. So after all of that, and without further ado, I bring in my two guests. It is an agronomist rematch. We've got Mike Cowbrough, weed specialist with OMAFRA, and Tammy Jones. Wait, I'll get your title right. Technical sales agronomist for Manitoba with Corteva. I wrote it down from your email. Was it correct? Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's a rematch and I'm going to win. So grand champion will work out.
Okay, so Jay, so welcome here, Mike. The gauntlet has been thrown, and here we go. Okay, so we are talking about not just weed control, but we're going to talk a little bit about shifting weed spectrums. And what's interesting, and here's where I want to start, although I'm going to try and get to the clip relatively quickly here to sort of set the tone for the evening. But Mike, we did, in preparing for this episode, we did realize that Ontario and Manitoba handle keeping track of which weeds are where and a problem quite differently.
Yeah.
So, Mike, why don't you tell us how Ontario does it, and then we'll compare.
Yeah, we do it on a shoestring budget. In other words, no resources. Western Canada has always been the envy of Eastern Canada in terms of actually putting resources towards regular surveys of agricultural fields. We do not do that in Ontario. There's kind of a mind. Maybe there's been a thought that we already know what's in fields, so we've had to take a different approach, which is more kind of, as opposed to on the ground in field surveys, relying more heavily on surveying the certified crop advisors and agronomists that serve farmers throughout Ontario. So, I mean, both have their merit, and I think both give good insight, but we certainly do it ad hoc and without any resources. So, but I got nothing else on that. It'd be nice to have budget. So.
So basically,
there you go.
I'm winning
all right.
already
So
because we have budget.
Flush with cash? Yes.
No.
There you go.
So Ag Canada is the lead resource behind Western Canadian weed surveys, and there is an illustrious group that has pursued doing weed surveys for a number of years and continue to do so, also on a shoestring budget, because it's by recruitment. We just find poor saps that are going to be wandering through fields already and make them do some more counts, and then hopefully ID the weeds right. I think that's one of the challenges out of any of these surveys is actual correctness of the weed ID. and then making sure that they can count to whatever number it is. So if it's green foxtail, that usually gets fairly high. Some of the other weeds a little bit easier, but there's a great group of Ag Canada researchers that really are spearheading it, coordinating it, and then boots on the ground with Manitoba Agriculture, Saskatchewan Agriculture, and Alberta as well, working through that, and a lot of volunteer hours in there.
Okay. So now that does bring up, we're going to go to our first clip, because if I don't do this now, I'll never get to it. So our first clip is a part of a conversation that Bern Tobin had with Peter Sikkema at, I believe it was the last in-person SWAC that we had. And it just quickly goes over, yes, some competitive things, but he hits on sort of why it's important that step number one is to figure out what weed spectrum you have in your field. So producer Jay, if we could go to the clip with Peter Sikkema.
Peter, you did an awesome conversation, awesome presentation on, some of the observations that you've made in 25 years of weed research. You had a top 10, and I want to go through a couple of those, and just some fascinating numbers too. And it really starts with corn is very sensitive to interference. You can lose typically up to 51% if you don't control your weeds.
And that is correct. In studies done in the province of Ontario, and the corn data is based on 80 field studies done over an 11-year period, the average yield loss is 51% in corn, and our yields go approximately from 200 bushels where we have perfect weed control to 100 bushels per acre where Ontario farmers would not have implemented any weed management tactics at all.
Wow. Another one you had was application timing, and I think we've learned for sure that the longer we delay, it's going to cost us.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think the hidden yield loss due to delayed herbicide application gets overlooked across the province of Ontario. And every year, Ontario farmers are losing millions of dollars simply because they delayed their post-emergence herbicide application too long. In the studies that we've done, and we have quite a few studies, on average, by delaying the herbicide by 1 day, so from Monday to Tuesday morning, there's an average yield loss of half a bushel per acre per day. However, if you have heavy weed pressure on your farm, that yield loss can be greater than 3 bushels per acre per day. So if corn sells for $5 a bushel, you're losing $15 an acre simply by delaying the application from Monday to Tuesday morning.
I want to talk about weed species. Especially when it comes to glyphosate, you really have to know and target your weed species to get the best control.
Yeah, and there's two aspects to that conversation. First of all, you have to know what weed species you have in each individual field. And secondly, you need to know the height of the weeds at the time of application, because both of those will influence what rate of glyphosate you need to get commercially acceptable control. So, for example, our data would say that you need 7 times as much glyphosate to control common ragweed compared to green foxtail. And similarly, as weeds increase in height, so if you go from a 4-inch lamb's quarters to a 12-inch lamb's quarters, you have to triple the rate of glyphosate to get commercially acceptable control.
Wow. Final point I want to talk about is time of day. It's amazing about application timing and the difference it can make.
Yes, and so I think that's really important, and I do want to stress that there is a time of day effect with almost every herbicide, every post-emergence herbicide that we use in Ontario. However, they're affected to different degrees. So the herbicide in our studies where we have the largest time of day effect would be something like Liberty, where we have a pretty dramatic time of day effect, and we can have up to a 50 bushel per acre yield difference between spraying at noon versus midnight. In contrast to that, glyphosate also has a time of day effect, but it's really small compared to some of the contact herbicides. However, you can document a difference in weed control when you spray when it's dark out. And in some situations, let's say a stressed environment, heavy weed pressure, large weeds at the time of application, even with glyphosate, you can document a difference in yield depending on what time of day you applied the herbicide.
Okay, so I'm hoping, no, still a delay. Okay, so everyone just don't look at my mouth moving, just listen to my words. My internet is being a jerk. Okay, so key points here. I mean, Peter Sikkema has covered all sorts of different work, but one of the key things there is, of course, know what you have in that field, but also the size of the weeds. Now, here's where we throw in a bit of a curveball in that depending on the weather, weeds can go through their growth stages more quickly, or they can actually adapt to conditions. So, Tammy, I'll start with you with the drought, and then Mike, I'll ask you about the spring and how everything was sort of slow and then took off and was way ahead. So, Tammy, in drought conditions, how do weeds adapt?
Oh, well, producer Jay should probably bring up that lovely lamb's quarters picture, and if he possibly could.
And if anyone's reading the
in the
chat,
meantime,
lambs are getting thrown under the bus. So just so you know, everybody.
I know.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, you can also eat lamb's quarters. As in addition to lamb, you can eat lamb's quarters. It's edible. I wouldn't say it's my favorite. It's got a weird texture, but it's edible. Anyway, that being said, this is maybe not the most beautiful picture of lamb's quarters, but it is important in a couple of different ways in that it's showing lamb's quarters in the heat of the day. And one of the weird things that it does is with its plant architecture, it kind of folds up like it's praying for some shade or something like that. And so it becomes much harder to target. And then the other thing that you'll notice is that it's got that gray mealy substance, that farnose on there, more substantially than it might in a nicer growing period. And so that makes it harder for herbicides to get into that leaf and actually do the job that they're supposed to do. So that's just one example of how weeds in a hot, dry setting will have some abilities to adapt and conserve moisture by, closing up like that, being less of a target to the sun as well as being less of a target to the herbicide. The other thing that you'll notice is that lamb's quarters is relatively short. And so sometimes we have this tendency to talk about height for weed control, like Peter just did, which is a little bit unfortunate because growth stages, short people are still, just as old as tall people are. It doesn't matter about that. So we should talk about the life cycle of the weed. So lamb's quarters will not grow, but still put out leaves. And so then we'll have a challenge because we're getting out of stage as far as the staging of that weed goes. It's easier to use height for sure, but unfortunately, counting those leaf pairs will help you out for staging on the lamb's quarters. Okay, so hot and dry, you'll have a thicker cuticle, you'll have all sorts of things that'll go on. You'll have things like crazy Russian thistle that'll grow in Carmen where it normally won't because it's usually too wet, and then yes. And so there's an example. You can see two little pin flags in there. I flagged it and saved it for the whole year just to prove to people that Russian thistle could actually grow in Carmen in a clay soil instead of in sand. So that being said, all sorts of weeds will proliferate and do well. Red root pigweed likes hot, green foxtail likes hot, and on and on. And so your weed species will shift. If it's a wet year, you'll have other weeds that will do a better job. And I think I've taken enough time. So Mike, we'll throw it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of good points. So the thing I might add to the dry weather and how that is impactful in next year and the year after is, one mechanism that a weed will do in dry years is, it's certainly producing less seed. And so, the goal of weeds is to create progeny to live on forever and ever. One of the things that it adapts to in dry years is the seed that it disperses will be less dormant. In some cases have very little to no dormancy because they're producing less seeds. They want them to germinate. And so, there's been studies looking at wild oats and wild mustard that in dry years, the percentage of seed that's dormant is less than in normal years. And sir, we run into the same problems in Eastern Canada with staging. You can have very small annual grasses that are tillering. So staging is better than height. But sure, yeah, for sure. And that's dry weather. certainly influences weed management, but that's usually why in a whole systems approach to weed management, you have various levels of, you're not just relying on one single post-emergent application or just, one method of control. You have to throw everything in the mix there.
Now, this spring, Mike, we had, that an early sort of start, then April cooled off, and then May picked back up again. And throughout the growing season, the crop was definitely more advanced. Were there weeds that got ahead of farmers in the same way that the crop was sort of roaring through its growth stages?
Yeah, we kept tabs on how quickly species like ragweed and lamb's quarters and the foxtails were progressing from stage. And like there was a period in there as things warmed up where within 2 to 3 days, they were easily putting out another 2 to 4 leaves. So they were getting, so things like pigweed, for example, and lamb's quarters were getting very large in a short amount of time. And so all that goes back to, again, from like a practical management perspective, is if you're, again, relying completely as a strategy, post-emergent herbicide pass, you don't have a lot of wiggle room to get that staging right. And so, a soil applied pass gives you some level of control, and then it minimizes, you're not dealing with a ton of lamb's quarters all coming up at various different times, progressing at different stages. You're dealing with less and hopefully a more uniform, consistent staging. So that's, for sure this year there was a window there where I think, Lindsay, like, again, for the audience to like take something practical of it, because like we could talk ourselves into circles about how it's too hot, too dry, too wet, too cold, and how that influences weeds. And if I'm sitting in the audience, I'm going, who cares? Thanks for the explanation. I think the thing it says to me is that like it's dollars well spent if you can't be in that field on a regular basis to hire someone to do it. Because with some of the post-emergent herbicides, the difference between going from 4-leaf lamb's quarters to 8-leaf lamb's quarters is the difference between control and no control, right? And then you have no options if you're in the no control camp.
Absolutely. Now, a few really good things. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, I have a delay. I apologize.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So do I. I can't watch myself on the screen either. It's very distracting. The other thing that we need to keep in mind in drier conditions is that even though those weeds are short and maybe not seemingly doing too much, the crop's also struggling. So everything you can do to help that crop out and make sure that you're in there early and remove those weeds so that maybe it does have the competitive advantage in the future, that's important as well. And then also keep in mind if you've got those winter annuals or perennials that are causing you issues, if you see those early on, those need to get removed as quickly as possible too. Sure, annual weeds are going to have some major catastrophes. And so Mike was right on when he said that having a pre to rely on, there you go, Mike, one win for you, is that we just need to have that pre in there so that it widens our window of opportunity for in-crop control. That you can do is make sure that when you do go for seeding, that or planting, depending on the crop, that you're making sure that you're adjusting to some of the conditions. So if you are seeing that it's a drier spring, making sure that you're seeding into moisture to give that crop its huge potential that it can have there, adjusting your seeding rates accordingly, all sorts of things like that, just to try and make sure that the crop gets the advantage and the weeds get the disadvantage.
So, okay, so two things. One, Viren had a question earlier. Why is chicory a crop in New Zealand, but a weed here? Mike?
Yeah.
Any ideas?
I'll tackle that. And I'll say a couple of points. First of all, to the audience, if it looks like I'm not smiling, this is my smiling face. My default appearance is one of curmudgeon, so I'm smiling.
Okay.
No, so like with chicory, yeah, I mean, whether it's a weed or to me, I've always thought the role of someone in Tammy's position or my position is to identify whether a weed has benefit or whether it's detrimental. And if it has benefit, you exploit it. And if it's detrimental, you get rid of it. And chicory is one of those weird ones that follows in a whole number of most species have pros and cons. And like, I mean, chicory has plenty of edible value. I think even like about 10 years ago, my colleague Francois Tardif noticed that like the dandelions that they sell in grocery stores is often chicory because the leaves look very much the same and you get bigger, more lush plants to sell. So yeah, and the roots can be ground into coffee. So it's I think here we take a pessimistic view of chicory. We view it as a weed, but I mean, there's plenty of places that treat it as an asset. And I guess if we could make money off it consistently, we would change our view on it as well.
I'll just, for all the naysayers in the comments, my sheep eat it. So there you go. And it does have beautiful blue flowers. But if you want to try and call the roots coffee, no, that's absolutely not. No, I should try
it
it
sucks.
first.
Like it's not
Yeah,
good.
okay.
It's
It's
I'll
bitter
try
like
anything.
mine.
Yeah. It's like what pioneers would do when they didn't have coffee. And no thanks. Anyway, okay. So staying in the chick family, chickweed, I've never heard this term before, is a pain in the sand in Chatham, Kent. Why is chickweed a pain in the sand, Mike?
Well, its life cycle, its ability to produce viable seeds is fairly short, and it also grows at very low temperatures. So, like, it's one of the first weeds you see green up in the spring. It's one of the last weeds you see dry off or brown off in the fall. And so, like, it's not. So here's the nuance. It's not actually difficult to kill a chickweed plant, but it's difficult to prevent it from continuing to germinate and produce. Like it's very good at, like, why it's on the sand is traditionally it's a good species to stop erosion. And so, looser soil, it's going to bind very well. So yeah, the challenge with chickweed is it's always spitting out new seeds. There's relatively low dormancy in those seeds. And so it'll kind of continue to germinate. And that's why it gets its name sometimes of carpet weed as well, because it can take over. So really the key is to try and match a residual herbicide with it, but keeping in mind that that's really going to just buy you a 4 to 6 week window of residual control. And then inevitably you're going to have more chickweed coming up after that. But, who cares kind of, because you've protected yield in the meantime.
Okay. Now,
Yeah.
Truman says spraying late in the fall is best. Is it best, or is that one of those ones that should kind of always be on your list?
Well, so to go back to, surveys, one of the things we do when we survey agronomists is ask them the blunt questions of, well, what's working well and what do you wish would happen on more acres in Ontario? And one of the things collectively is fall applications or fall management. And, Truman speaks to the value of it for chickweed, and there's also value of it for perennial weeds. Yes, especially with a weed like chickweed that, again, produces seed all the time. Like if you have to kind of try and manage it all throughout the year, and being in that late window is a good place to be.
Okay, so now we've got some discussion here on the glyphosate question and John, I think we'll come back to that at some point about, stewardship of glyphosate and access to it and all those sorts of things. And I don't expect the two of you as agronomists to get political, don't worry. But one of the things, of course, that we are talking about, and we haven't touched on herbicide resistance just yet all that much, but anytime we put selection pressure, so whether that's weather or whether that's rotation, on the weed spectrum, we might outsmart certain weeds, but we end up potentially encouraging others. So Tammy, you've got some lovely graphs that I think are from the 1970s that compare some, they're really crisp. Anyway, but looking at tillage, and which tillage is really selection pressure, right? And its impact on some weed species. So walk us through some of that.
Okay, so perhaps maybe when I stole them from wherever I stole them from, I didn't do that great of a job. But if producer Jay would so be inclined to share them, that would be even better. Makes it easier. So it's actually some work that was done with downy brome and winter wheat, and looking at, how to shake it up. And I think that's that the variety is the spice of life as far as those kinds of things go. So if you have a mental picture in your head of a y-axis and an x-axis, because I don't see anything on the screen at this point
Jay,
in
can
time.
you bring in some of those tillage, tillage? Maybe he fell asleep.
Oh,
I
yeah.
don't know. Anything's possible
I
at
don't
this point.
know.
Maybe he's trying to find it.
I cannot seem to find them right now.
Okay.
Oh,
Well, I
that's
mean,
awkward.
we could
Okay, so
No, what does
imagine.
happen?
Yes,
Imagine
do an
that
audible here.
down in
and-
Are they in the weed species series?
Sure. Why don't we take an
No.
audible, producer Jay, and look at some of the Ontario survey data, beginning with, let's look at like dandelion.
There you go.
Let's see.
And I'm just
which-
waiting for someone in the. Oh, sorry, that's in Mike's PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
that's
Which
Yeah,
which
the
slide would it
dandelion
be?
one.
It's
I have
slide
it in
number
front of me.
6.
Oh, 6.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks, Jay.
Yeah.
There we
So
go.
yeah, and this is perfect, Jay. We'll go to the next 3 after this. Like, I was basically looking. So, the last time we did a really extensive survey was around 2015, and then prior to that was 10 years previous. And I kind of wanted to just kind of summarize what I would call the biggest climbers and the biggest fallers in terms of ranking. How many places did they rise or fall? And so there's 3 weeds here that, are a direct result of probably tillage practices in the province. Like, it's no secret that a weed like dandelion is best controlled with something like a moldboard plow in the fall. And then every time any tillage tool that's kind of less aggressive, whether that's, a disc or a vertical tillage tool, it's just not going to be as effective. And so the byproduct of that is you see more people using vertical tillage or maybe even strip till and less kind of fall moldboard plow, is you tend to see an increase in weeds like dandelion. So it increased, by 13, a ranking of increased by 13 in corn and 7 in soys, and then not as much maybe in cereals. If we go to the next slide, Jay.
And just while you're advancing to the next slide, I'm going to say that in Manitoba with dandelion, if we look at 1978, it was like 30th in the province, and now it's about 7. So definitely, as we see reduction in tillage, we see the same thing happening here.
Yeah, and the same for a perennial species like tufted vetch, where really it's pretty tolerant to a lot of herbicides, especially in the soybean and corn marketplace. And then in cereals, the challenge is it's a general late germinator, but kind of holistically, you're not going to usually get your way out of a vetch problem with herbicides alone. Like, tillage has to be a component of it. And what you're seeing with the cereals in particular, like quite a high ranking, is again, like as you kind of lower aggressive tillage in those systems, you're going to you're going to shift to certain weeds, tufted vetch being one of them. And then probably the last one, Jay, on wild carrot is kind of putting it all together, where in a perfect world, right, we talk about many little hammers, the typical weed person's cliche around, cultural control mirrored with herbicide control. Well, wild carrot is one of those species that's, a biennial, short-lived perennial, pretty large taproot. So you need an aggressive tillage tool to uproot it and get rid of it. But it also the seed will germinate in the fall and the spring. So that's a problem because you can't just manage it at one time of the year. And then from a chemistry standpoint, we're pretty limited to what's effective on it. Really, it's herbicides it's actually quite tolerant to glyphosate. So now you're seeing a combination of, we've shifted largely to glyphosate tolerant crops. This is a species that's more tolerant to glyphosate. We've used less aggressive tillage. And so that was also helpful in controlling this weed. And then we're really left with one herbicide group that's effective on wild carrot. So that kind of, trifecta of changing to a largely glyphosate production system, less tillage, and then limited additional chemistries, and you see an increase in prevalence of things like wild carrot. So that's kind of how the other management and rotation and tillage effect shifts in species.
The snarky in me wants to say, just take wild carrot and domesticate it, and then we have a new crop. I think we could call it carrot. But anyway,
But that's what they did. Like,
I know. I'm just saying.
okay,
So
all
no,
right.
I'm being ridiculous. See there, you
Okay,
smiled. There, my
fair
job
enough.
is done. Okay, so I do want to send so hello to Warren, so Farmer Schneck, who says, I saw my plows today. Dandelion pressure is not enough of a reason for me to use them, though. Now I'm waiting for someone else to say that weeds don't become resistant to iron, but I challenge that with, of course, but iron isn't necessarily terribly effective for several weeds. It's only really, tillage only works for some, right? So anyway, I was waiting. Someone I'm sure
So
will get there.
tillage works for downy brome, but it doesn't necessarily work for something that germinates in crop, right? So if you've got kochia,
Right.
for instance, like we do in Manitoba, unless you can get those infrared guided cameras and you can do narrow row tillage on the 6-inch or 7.5-inch spacings, like some of the manufacturers are looking at now, then maybe we can start to use tillage in crop. But you've got to think about root pruning and drying out the soil, or if it's too wet, then compaction and on and on and on. So I have friends who don't like tillage, just like that plow. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, like
There
it
you
should
go.
be.
Also, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Lindsay, it's not positioned in a place of judgment. Like, I mean, people can decide for themselves what tillage practice works best for their operation, and it's far be it from me to judge that. It's just a recognition, though, that it will have an impact on the types of species that you're going to shift to in your field. Like, I've made changes to my own personal crop rotation that have shifted things to winter annuals, and so now I have to adjust to that. So it's unfortunately not rocket science. It's rolling up sleeves and paying attention to what's showing up in fields as you make these tweaks to management, and then finding ways to address them.
Yeah, it's making the conscious decision, right? Like it's about knowing what you're going to do and then managing it. And so that's where most weed control is about variety, so that the weeds don't get ahead of you. And sometimes we fail epically and sometimes we work really well at it.
That's right. Sometime. Now, that is a great segue. I am going to mention, of course, tonight our show sponsor, Adama Canada. So thanks to them. We do have some great comments in the chat as well about which weeds tillage, of course, does not help. Things like quackgrass, horsetail, and that really fun, the yellow nutsedge that has nutlets, which is probably my favorite weed term. Also, Mike, in prepping for this, I did look through some of your agronomy, the surveys that agronomists, and I learned a new, this is a weed I'd never heard of, stinking mayweed, which I
Yeah.
can't help but feel, is also maybe a great thing to yell at someone when they're naughty. You stinking mayweed. Anyways, so that's my new favorite one. I've never heard of it before. Is it down in the Southwest? Am I just blind to it? What's going on?
It's from the chamomile family, and it stinks, right? Like it's not again, not rocket science. It smells and it looks like chamomile. And just a couple of things I see on the chat there, like John mentioned, tillage will spread things like quackgrass around. Absolutely. Interestingly enough, that's one species in Ontario that if you look back 20, 30 years ago, like there was committees dedicated to getting rid of like quackgrass in the province, and to the point now where we really don't, like, it doesn't show up on surveys. Like it's kind of a non-issue. And a large part of that has been chemical controlled, to be truthful, like the proliferation of Roundup Ready crops and a lower price of glyphosate, which was effective on quackgrass. I mean, that's an example of, like a positive shift, right? Like we were able to use tools that were wildly effective, and that's largely become a weed that's a bit of a non-issue nowadays.
All right, before we go to our next clip, because it does, as the two of you have sort of alluded to, it brings in some of the new tools or newer tools that we do have at our disposal. Some more tiny hammers, apparently. Also to John, yes, I would also love Starling. I can't get it yet. But before we do that, Peter had a really good question about, in making the decision on controlling weeds, what trumps what? Is it crop stage, weed stage, as far as your strategy? Obviously, we have limits on what labels say and those sorts of things, but what matters most, the weed stage and size or the crop stage and size?
Well, I mean, I would go on the basis of weed stage because you know, certainly with conventional herbicides, I would go with weed stage because it's a lot more sensitive. I think we know as weeds come up earlier before crops, they impact yield more. So if we focus on weed stage as a metric by which we get in there and do things, and provided our standard of what a small weed is small and not 20, 30 centimeters tall, then I think you can accomplish both. The crop staging is more like a guide just to be aware of when the critical period of weed control is. I still think you base it on weed stage because that's going to make the herbicide fail or succeed. And then you use crop stage as your guide for the important, of when that's most critical or when it should be weed free.
I would agree with Mike in that typically we're looking at the weed stage because typically we have a number of different herbicides that we can tailor to depending on what our crop stage is like. There are certain ones that get eliminated if it's later on, and we have some timing issues in that respect. And genuinely, we're focusing on early weed removal for the most part. So then we're really looking at the weed staging and trying to time it with that. I'm usually driven by the weeds rather than the crop because I want to kill the weeds. I'd also like to put a shout out to Scott, who brought up the barnyard grass example, because we all love the barnyard grass example of selection pressure and how back in the day with hand weeding and visual selection, we selected out, not me, someone far before me, although close to my age. And they hand selected, visually selected to ensure that the barnyard grass looked like the rice and that you couldn't visually tell the difference between them. And so that selection pressure works just the same that every other selection pressure works. Variety. That's the spice of life and the way to manage weeds.
Farmer Schneck says, if it fits under the high clearance sprayer, it is small. And so let's all just, Warren, that's hilarious.
Oh, he's being tongue in cheek.
He's being very, yes. No, that is not how that works. And also, then what do you do for velvet leaf? So there you go. Anyway, okay, so I do want to, and Mike, eagle-eyed Mike here, pointed out that for one of our clips tonight, we should definitely show a bit of some alternative ways to take care of weeds, and one of which is this clip from the Sharp Edge series that we have here at Real Agriculture, and in looking at zapping weeds. So producer Jay, let's go to that clip.
So one of the tools that we've found over the years is the weed zapper, and that's turned out to be a really phenomenal addition to our farm in terms of late summer weed control, both in edible beans and soybeans.
Right, so we're early August right now, and you are out doing this weed zapping over the top. Talk to us a little bit about how that machine actually can kill the weed that's sticking up above the canopy.
So it's essentially the machine itself is a high voltage bar that's up in front of the tractor. It's powered by a 155 kilowatt generator. There's a transformer mounted in the back of the cabinet behind the tractor, and it steps it up to about 13,000 volts, which 13,000 volts is the voltage at the front of the tractor, the front bar.
Right.
And so when you're driving over the field, essentially anything that's sticking above the canopy that bar can touch, it'll electrocute it. What happens is it turns the stem of the weed into a conductor, and it shoots electricity through that stem, and I think it essentially it boils the vascular system of that plant, so there's no nutrients that can move up or down. And so, over the course of a few days, it starts to dry down, and it dies right down to the root.
Yeah, so when I was originally looking or thinking about the weed zapper, I thought sort of like a toaster going over top and doing physical damage to the weed, but I had a hard time getting my head around that it actually sends current right down the stem. So you don't just do physical damage to the top, you actually the voltage takes the plant right out.
Correct. Yeah. So it's not like a toaster element that's going to heat it up and burn it, although you can burn some plants.
Yeah.
And there is some physical damage to the surface of the plant, but you're essentially on a cellular level. You're taking out the plant, at its vascular system by boiling those cells with electricity.
So lots of soybean growers, not just organic growers, have problems with these late emerging weeds. Rainfall's been abundant this year. You start getting weeds coming up over the top of the canopy. You don't really have many other options if you can't go down the road of something like this weed zapper. What are your favorite targets in terms of weeds that are traditionally a problem that the weed zapper can take out?
Well, essentially anything that it touches, it will kill. I would say different weeds show more quickly. So something like a sow thistle, which has got a lush stem with a lot of juice in it, that's a fantastic conductor. And so you see that effect really, really quickly. A lot of current goes through that weed. Same thing with lamb's quarter, ragweed, all those weeds. The younger they are, the better it seems to work. So once you've got a really, really tall, like a 6-foot pigweed, for instance, it has a harder time with that. You might need to take a few swipes at it. You might need to make 2 or 3 trips in order to kill a big weed like that. Right. I find that velvet leaf, it's got a woody, thick stem, and that the velvet leaf sometimes takes a few swipes with the zapper, so maybe 2 passes to kill a decent sized velvet leaf, just because of the physical structure of that stem. Right. So I guess to summarize, it's the lusher the stem, the younger the stem, the better it works.
I should have known the comments would devolve just a little, Anyway, super cool technology. And when we talk about, selection pressure, I mean, this is one of those ones. I think we've outlined a little bit of the things that can make it work better or not as well. But can a plant actually evolve to go around this? I'm going to guess they just get shorter. Anyway, but Mike, you've got some slides to sort of dig into the zapper a little bit more.
That's right. Yeah. So I'm mindful of Tammy and I just said, a producer should, with lamb's quarters use soil applied herbicides and then be scouting and perfectly time their post-emergent herbicide. And probably some people watching this are like, yeah, genius. I try and do that all the time. And still I have lamb's quarters escapes. And that's where I think tools like this are there as a last minute rescue to stop seed dispersal. And we were looking at it just from the purposes this year to see if it was worthy of looking further, not only in terms of pre-harvest weed control, but maybe even as a desiccant in crops. So here on the slide is an example of lamb's quarters where you have the control on the left and then kind of a typical desiccant in the middle. And, the electrocution with the zapper seemed to do a nice job. If we look to slide 5, there's a kind of a close-up comparing the desiccant and the zapper, and it does a nice job of maybe browning the stem more than the desiccant, but that's, again, just at the basis of one site here. I was really encouraged with the next slide to see the level of control within about 5 days of perennial sow thistle. Now I'm skeptical because I think clearly you need to start killing roots to be effective on perennial sow thistle. So it'll be interesting to follow up next year. I don't hold out much hope, but any top growth control is good, and so things like that get me intrigued. But then the last slide, just illustrates that there's no panacea here. One of the observations by doing this is we're very good at getting those weeds that are above the canopy, because this is more or less just an electrified weed wicker, really, when you break it down. But we miss all those low canopy weeds. Like in this case, it's hairy nightshade, hairy galansoga, even Canada thistle sometimes is below the canopy. So, it's not going to be for every weed, but it seems to be very effective on some of the common ones that we struggle with on an annual basis: the lamb's quarters, the pigweed, the ragweed.
Mm-hmm. So, and of course, as he shared in the video, some of these might take a couple passes. So now we're talking time and horsepower and fossil fuel to do it, right? So everything has a trade-off as well. But again, it's pretty neat. And then one of the other things, and I didn't run the clip, but one of the other units is, of course, it's more popular in Australia, but has been gaining here in Canada. We have a couple of units here. Is some form of seed destructor on the combine. So, and Tammy's all excited. So Tammy, I'll go to you. Do you have any experience with any of them? Because there's several different models now on the market.
So back in the day, it was the toe behind Harrington seed destructor type of scenario, and now there is, and I reluctantly say this, but it's a strap-on unit. So Mike, you need to smile at that. Come on, that was funny. Anyway, so and there are some people in Western Canada that are using some of these for fairly successfully. Would I say that it's doing 100% weed control? No, but it is reducing the amount of seed that's returned to the seed bank, and every little bit helps. So Josh Lade in Saskatchewan is doing a lot with it, averaging about $10 an acre for maintenance costs and the horsepower that are used with the combine, that sort of thing. So definitely there are some costs with it, but if you're looking at the economics of weed control, that's going to start to work out pretty good as we have some challenging weeds that we need to work with. So it's an interesting one. There's also the comb. If you're not into zapping weeds and you don't want to lick that electrocution unit, then the comb cut was one that came along and just chopped the seed heads off or the blooms off before they set seed. There's lots of opportunities out there for different mechanical options other than tillage. So I really like where Mike's going with this. I've seen it work in a couple of scenarios, but I'm more worried about some of our narrow row spacings that we're not going to have as much opportunity just because we need to focus where that electrocution happens. And there's also people that are looking by the comments, probably not going to be suited for the unit.
That is 100% accurate in that I think electricity is magic. And so I cannot be trusted around it. So I won't be using that. No, I mean, I definitely see a place for it. And, it could be more in specialty applications or in higher value crops. So whether it's identity preserved, Tammy's reading the comments, I'm not making them public. But realistically, same thing with any sort of weed seed destructor. It really is only going to be effective for those that have set seed at harvest, right? It still has to go through the combine and they get destroyed there. So, I mean, something that is, again, perhaps like a dandelion that's not, it's down below the canopy. It's going to come back after, right? Yeah, it's going to be specific to certain weeds.
It does work surprisingly well on limiting some of the wild oats because we do know that we see them in a harvest sample. So we know that we are collecting some in the combine. But certainly if you're looking at something like fleabane where it's set seed and it's floated off ahead of time, that's never going to work for that. It's not bad on the pigweeds, including the water hemp and the Palmer amaranth from some of the work that's been done. But again, it's going to vary and it's only going to be suited for certain types of weeds and certain production systems for sure.
And Peter Johnson noting here, Mike, as well, with the kill the tall weed scenario, the yield damage is done. But I mean, this is partially a quality thing. This is partially a harvest management. This is partially trying to remove these seeds from the seed bank, right?
Right. So there's kind of two things to follow up with. Like, I get all the comments about like, this is expensive, it's too much horsepower, it's all this kind of stuff. And I think the perspective that we have to look at it, although not practical in the short term, is as these technologies evolved and come to bigger scale and get refined, the price goes down. We figure out, like, we were doing weed maps in the late 1990s that was like insanely labor intensive and not practical. And now, like, the things we can do now are quite easy compared to what took literally days and weeks to do 20 years ago. So, I think we're at a stage where let's figure out if it has value, and then hopefully the market takes care of itself. And, if people ask for and demand things like, harvest seed destructors, then, once you get the manufacturers on board, like once they have it as an option or a standard, then things go from there. To Peter's point, yeah, like I get that things like the zapper and stuff, like the damage from a yield perspective is already been done. But again, the focus of today's show a little bit was around weed spectrum shifts and stuff. And so, yep, there's the early part that's all about yield, but it, we should not ignore the late season part where I think we need to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of late control, because it's the seed that doesn't cause yield loss, though, but is contributing to the seed bank. And ultimately, that's what we have to deal with 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. So, yeah, like I think we're at a stage, right, when you talk to growers and their frustration about some of these species like water hemp that's still germinating in August and setting seed. The reality is we need a solution that covers the gamut. Like 6 to 8 weeks of control isn't going to cut it anymore.
Right. And to that end, this is where, in talking about, it's not always going to be a chemical control, because we're not just talking about the yield robbing, we're talking about trying to decrease potentially the return to the weed seed bank. So these are other options that we have. So which is, and as some of the comments I'm pointing out as well, it does depend which cropping system you're in. Some of these may lend themselves to an organic system or IP or higher value product than potentially just broadacre. Now, I want to bring this back actually to the person who suggested this whole episode, Jason Vogt out of Manitoba. And so in talking about weed species shifts, Tammy, I have to say that word carefully. Manitoba, most of the prairies, has been in a bit of a dry cycle, but I grew up in Manitoba. It usually doesn't stay dry for very long. And then sometimes we end up on the other end of the spectrum and end up in a very wet cycle. So let's, do the rain dance, hope that perhaps we're even moving back to more average rainfall for Manitoba specifically. What weed species do you see coming back in wetter cycles, or which ones do you see sort of coming in dry cycles? Do you see that in the surveys at all as to which ones move through? Mike's laughing because it's like the world's hardest question.
I'm looking forward to this answer. She's going to predict.
Yeah. So with my crystal ball, this should be fascinating.
Yeah,
I do want to offer up one slight correction. You never grew up, so this is going to
that's true.
Color
okay, you're right.
Mm-hmm. Anyway,
okay.
All right, good.
Mm-hmm.
See, Mike, I don't just take shots at you. I take shots at everyone. It's fair game.
I can take.
That being said, I think that a couple of the ones that probably do better in wetter conditions would be something really ridiculous, like broadleaf plantain is one that seems to like it in more moist type of growing conditions. I would say night flower and catchfly, those types of things also tend to like that. Round leaf mallow will do good in any type of conditions. Wild oats like it cool, and they will take advantage of the moisture. So that is another one. And then, probably your volunteer crops become more of a problem. They have no dormancy. And so whatever you grew the year before now becomes more of a weed because of that. As compared to some of these other weeds like red root pigweed and lamb's quarters and kochia that all love the hot, dry conditions and will do better with that. And I would think one of the other ones that I would be more concerned about in a wet type of growing season would be water hemp, just because it's one that we aren't used to managing and we don't understand what we're doing for the most part in a lot of scenarios. And so I've seen it do well in some moist conditions in Manitoba, and I'm sure that Mike has more experience than I do, so I'm not going to say more than that.
Well, there's two things that I've learned. One, Lindsay does not like the word moist. We can tell that already.
Really? Thank you, Mike, for pointing
I guess the only thing
out.
I was going to follow up on is like the broadleaf plantain. So that's an interesting one too, because if we look at kind of herbicide sensitivity, it's quite tolerant to dicamba. And so maybe not necessarily an issue in Western Canada, but as we shift soybeans and other crops to more kind of dicamba-based technology, that's going to be a weakness that probably would be selected for. I know selfishly, kind of from an Ontario perspective, the one species that I see on the rise, regardless of, wet or hot conditions, dry conditions, is, and one that climbed the most in our surveys from 2005 to 2015 was annual bluegrass, or species in the bluegrass family. And, Peter Sikkema mentioned in that earlier video that things like winter wheat typically only see about 3% yield loss from weeds. The exception is some of the more kind of dense winter annual weeds, of which annual bluegrass falls, where in Michigan they've seen up to 50% yield loss. So, things like that are a game changer, and it's going to require more kind of residual chemistry, unfortunately, to deal with it. It's not just a glyphosate only solution in corn and soys.
Well, Mike, I was potentially going to leave it, but I'll bring it up. The specter of the access to glyphosate. So I'm not going to go so far as to say, what happens when we don't have glyphosate or we don't whatever, but I'll put it in this context. Has our access to very affordable glyphosate and glyphosate tolerant crops, has that produced specific weed problems?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think more so than any other herbicide that's been good and been used a lot. Like, I think if we looked historically, like, I don't know, the early 90s and soybeans, like Pursuit and Clean Sweep was the cat's meow, and it got used on a ton of acres. And then we saw problems with that. So I don't know. I'd have to take a hard look and say, is it worse than other innovations in herbicides in the marketplace? My guess is probably not. The comparable sometimes people will compare glyphosate to atrazine in terms of like, yep, sure, there's resistance, but we still, it still has utility, it still has value. Aside from whether it's flat out banned or not, which who the heck knows, right? But in terms of like utility as a herbicide, I can't foresee a time in the near future, and that's 10 to 20 years, that it would still not have value. It might not. I think we're getting at the stage where it's not a standalone solution for some producers. And I think that trend will continue. And, you hope that it opens up a market for more focus on discovery of other solutions. I mean, that's the one negative of it, is it works so well. It was so cost effective. The bar was risen so high that it's tough as an organization to find something that is just as good and worthy to bring to the marketplace. And so I think we'll pay for that in the short term.
Mike, I like that your short term, medium term is 10 to 20 years. So it gives me such hope. All right, but Tammy, are you okay to leave it with Mike on that one, or do you have anything to add to that discussion?
Well, I think he's 100% right in that we've been almost trained that herbicides work so perfectly that we shouldn't have to worry about anything else, and we shouldn't be looking at any of these other things. And the reality is that as we've progressed and weeds have gotten harder to control because of a variety of different adaptations that they've made, we just need to look at alternative types of scenarios. And there are some really simple things like altering your seeding date, altering the seeding rate, choosing a variety that's really suited for your area. And that does vary from area to area, what you should be growing and how you should be growing it. We're blessed in Western Canada to have wildly extensive numbers of crops that we can grow. And sometimes we just don't choose to grow them because the short-term economics aren't there, but the long-term economics probably are. And so we're going to be forced over time to do more and more different things to get the production that we're so accustomed to. As far as glyphosate, oh man, 3 for Mike. Peter, stop counting. This is just getting depressing. I'm going to have to quit at this. But as far as glyphosate, it probably should never have been a standalone, and then maybe we would have extended its life for a little bit longer, but hindsight's 2020. And so we just need to look at how we can continue to extend its use in the future. And I think it's been really helpful in increasing the acres and helping to feed the world in the short term. And so we have lots of work to do for the long term, but we're okay for now, and as far as utilizing it as a tool still.
All right. And Tammy, I'm going to add rotation, a robust rotation to your list. Now, Manitoba, of course, has like 7 or 8 crops that they can include, and Ontario has as many as 4. Anyway, so that's, or at least that's the impression I get.
Do I
right,
win
Mike?
there?
Yeah, there, you get a point because you can pick from that many. Okay. No, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you to everyone in the comments. Always wonderful to have your questions and comments. And I did want to very quickly before we go and wrap this up, did want to remind everyone that next week, 8 p.m. Eastern, we'll have Peter Johnson, Bern Tobin, and myself will be wrapping up sort of the year that was and tackling the top agronomy topics of the year. So Tammy Jones, thank you so much. Mike Cowbrough, thank you as well. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. That is our show brought to you by Adama Canada and Real Ag Radio, as well as Mind Your Farm Business. Thank you all for joining me this evening. This was a lot of fun and lots of things learned. Love the comments. And as always, wonderful to see everyone in the comments. Thanks for coming back week after week. Although, Warren, I hope one of these nights you're actually combining because it's December 13th. Anyway, all right. Everyone head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow and make sure you let us know that you watched and get those CEU credits. All right. Cheers, everybody.